Hello, and welcome to the Matriarchy with Kath and Lisa.
Hello.
We are so excited again to be here talking to you all with a very special guest, Jenny Chan. She actually, we just learned, found us through YouTube. So we're super excited that we're being seen on YouTube. So that was good news. But what she's bringing to us today is information about the work that she does, which is just really interesting and very pertinent to today's world. So without going any further into it, I'm going to pass it to Kath and she can tell us a little bit more about Jenny.
Great. I'm glad that here the matriarchy is spreading even on YouTube. So welcome, Jenny. We are delighted to have you here and just wanted to introduce Jenny to our audience. Jenny Chan is the director of Pacific Atrocities Education, or PAE, a San Francisco-based nonprofit she established in 2014 to raise awareness of World War II atrocities in the Asia-Pacific region, such as the Nanjing Massacre, Unit 731, and the Comfort Women's System, through books, videos, and digitized archives that have engaged over 800,000 online visitors annually. Under her leadership, PAE's internship program, offering opportunities for research, community outreach, digital archiving, and oral history, has profoundly shaped participants' careers, with other former interns advancing to become professors and scholars. Welcome, Jenny. We are so happy to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. So who inspired you and how did you find your voice?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. It was so funny because the other day I was doing a podcast and I was thinking to myself, like, wow, I'm in this good old boys club.
We're trying to rewrite that a little.
And it's we're very focused on more of the untold stories. And for example, like Comfort Women that we're going to get to later. And what inspired me was that growing up, my grandma had always told me about Hong Kong being occupied by the Japanese. And so whenever I turn on like my Japanese anime show, she would be upset. She would be like, oh, those turnip heads, they were really brutal and blah, blah, blah. And I didn't want to listen to her talk about that. And so I would just turn it off or I'd turn to another channel to watch Winnie the Pooh, whatever. And she was okay with Winnie the Pooh, but she was not okay with Doraemon, which was like a fat robot cat that came from the future. It was a Japanese anime. I think it was the Japanese anime that really triggered her. And I was too little to understand why or to really, sit down and try to listen. I'm just trying to watch my cartoon. and after she passed away, we found a box of like military yen and like rice rationing coupons and whatnot. And that's when I realized that the story that she was telling me was real, like, that she did starve probably as a kid. And it was more powerful for me to see these objects and and things that she kept. And after the war, the military yen was really worth nothing. So her family was pretty poor after the war. So that's what inspired me to start reading more like The Rape of Nanking and like the Rising Sun by John Toland and The Flags of Our Fathers. But if you read The Rising Sun by John Toland, it's like all these Japanese politicians, and he tried to explain like what had happened in the war, but then you still don't feel like you're getting the human stories of what had happened to those people when Japan was occupying Asia. And The Rape of Nanking is a great story about like the human stories that happened in Nanking. But if you read the stats, like the lower stats of how many were killed in Asia was 30 million people. And the Rape of Nanking, although it was awful, it's only like 300,000 people. And that's like a fraction of the number of people who were killed in World War II. And if you look at Flags of Our Fathers, that's happening later down the war. And so you have this whole period of history to millions of people, that's tens of millions of people that were really dark, and it's dark in the sense that awful things happen to them and no one's ever talked about it. And so
Yeah.
I thought, after reading all these books, I thought, well, there must be a nonprofit dedicated to this, since there are so many Holocaust centers and we talk about what had happened in concentration camps and whatnot. And I couldn't find any nonprofit or any research center. And my background is in econ and stats, which is another very male dominated subject. And, and I thought, well, maybe I can go look for a job as a data analyst or something related to this topic. And I couldn't find anything. And so I thought, I was very naive. I was in my 20s. And so I thought, well, why don't I start something? And so
Here you are.
and so here I am. Like, I mean, if had I realized how difficult it was going to be, like from fundraising to like people having no idea what I'm talking about. We were hosting a conference. I was talking to a reporter and I was telling her about all these things and the number of people that were murdered basically during World War II in Asia. She was looking at the number like 30 million that couldn't be. And so she like did a whole month of research, and then she talked to her friends, and her friends are like, and her friends who are Asian were like, yeah, that really did happen.
Yeah.
And so then like after a whole month of her own independent research, she decided to like feature a conference. But it just shows that like there still needs to be a lot more to be told in the West, and also doing research about this untold part of historical truth of what had happened to tens of millions of people, and also all the stories in between. It's just been very fascinating, and it's been difficult in terms of like, for example, funding and like trying to, because a lot of these documents are so fragile and we're trying to digitize them. They're like fragile to the point that they're being like shredded. I remember opening a box from the National Archives, and I'm like, wow, if I don't scan this now, there's not going to be another 80 years where these documents are going to be around. Because during World War II, they were made out of like compound paper, and like onion peel paper, because of the lack of resources. Versus in like even times like Civil War, the paper was still made out of like cotton blends, so they're like thicker, and that's like actually harder to break, for example. And so, yeah, so that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years. And that was a very
Well,
answer for you.
no, yeah,
Yeah.
not at all. It's you've become like quite the historian, going to the actual sources and archive materials, and you've interviewed I'm sure lots of people in Asia, but what struck me was the interviews that you had of women on your website. Those are hard to read. I mean, the stories that happen. So, um, your work often uncovers these forgotten histories, like especially the experiences of women and communities during World War II. So, tell us why it's so important to make these stories visible, like especially now.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, when we think about war, or when Hollywood display war, they think about like military history. It's like these guys in shiny uniform, but they don't think about women being impacted in the war. So, for example, like in 2015, I went and visited this village in Shaanxi, which were invaded by Japanese. And it was so interesting what had happened to these women in part of this invasion. A lot of women were rounded up to go to a so-called comfort camp. And I'm sorry, it's for your listeners, it's going to get graphic. So, she was there, like, and she was raped, like, several times a day, and like different soldiers, and this was like a comfort station that they had set up. And what's interesting is that like she didn't talk about it after the war, because one of the women that I interviewed got pregnant, and her mom told her, oh, don't tell anyone about this, don't tell anyone about your pregnancy. And after she gave birth, then she was her mom brought her to a cave where they buried the baby, and she didn't talk about it since until like in 2015. Like I think it was like in 2010s she started talking about it,
Mm.
and I just so happened to see it on Chinese social media, and I went and visited her, and it's like those kind of stories that need to be told
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
times of war, because people don't. I mean, there's not a whole lot of like Hollywood movies where they display like women fighting in wars and whatnot, or like what
Yeah.
happens to the woman. And it's also very interesting talking on this topic. We also interviewed some of the Filipina who were fighting in the
Mm.
Philippines during World War II, because MacArthur had in 1942 he said, "I'll be back," and so then all hope was really lost.
Mm.
And this story is actually kind of funny, because when the Japanese invaded the Philippines, she was like, some of the women were telling us that they were excited because they thought that the Japanese were going to liberate them from American
Mhm.
rules and whatnot, colonization.
Mm.
But when they saw firsthand how brutal the Japanese soldiers were, like getting people, she was seeing people getting beheaded and whatnot, then she
Mm.
started, um, then people were becoming like guerrilla fighters. And because MacArthur had said, "I'll be back," they really had no resources, and they held off like for 2.5 years. And so you don't really think about women fighting in wars, but then like these women started like learning how to shoot, and like they were gathering weapons just to protect those around them. And so I think it's very interesting in terms of like um those untold stories, not just like um from underrepresented and also from women that happened in World War II, especially in Asia.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You're right that we don't look at how war impacts women and children
Yeah.
um enough. I mean, maybe once in a while you'll see a scene in a movie, just a little snippet. Why do you think that is? Why do you think we don't look at that more?
I think because historically people don't write that kind of narrative more often, right? It's probably sexier for Hollywood to display something like in a shiny uniform going to a set, and then like they're like fighting, but then we're not thinking about how when there's a war, it's not, it's not like a pretty set that people go
Right.
to. It's like someone's liquor store, right? It's like someone's gas station that they're going to be fighting in front of. Hollywood depiction of wars are not
They
totally.
they glorify it, right?
Yes,
And
exactly. In the way is more glorified because
yeah.
and
And so I think like if you did show the reality of what happens to women in war, that glorification would really lose some punch. Right? I mean,
yeah, I think so.
it's so sobering.
Rural China setting was very heart-wrenching for me. Like, I interviewed her in 2015. It took me 2 years to write the book. And I called it
Yeah.
historical fiction because I couldn't verify everything that she said before she passed away. But like it was based on her oral interview. And it's insane to me that the media doesn't cover the current day Japanese South Korea relationship.
Mm,
So the South Koreans,
right.
a lot of South Koreans were basically sex slaves for the Japanese, because they were also comfort women, because Japan had conquered Korea um, right after Teddy Roosevelt negotiated for the Treaty of Portsmouth. And so then they were promised like some jobs, and then they weren't really jobs. They became comfort women. And
Mm,
so in South Korea, there was a big movement to seek reparation from the Japanese government for all of these women who were enslaved during World War II. And what really like, and so every Wednesday they have this, there was a comfort woman statue in front of the Japanese embassy in South Korea. And every Wednesday, they go and protest and try to seek reparations and like seek
Interesting.
apology. And that's not something that you really hear about in the media,
no.
especially in the
Never.
West.
Never.
Not a word is right. Is it still going on, these protests?
Yeah,
Or
I was
okay.
on Facebook the other day and I saw that people were still protesting. And I think the last of the comfort women have already passed away. And it's just so incredible that these stories don't make it to the Western media. And also in the Philippines, they try to have a comfort woman statue. But then because Philippines depend a lot on the Japanese investment, so then the
Mhm.
president actually removed the statue in Manila, the comfort woman statue, to remember the women who were captured as sex slaves. It's because of economic reason. They were like, oh, Japan is now an ally because of they have a lot of economic incentive to work with Japan. And so then I think that's a lot of reasons why we don't hear about it, is like economic and political issues. And
Yeah.
so then like women's role is almost like a backdrop. And in the Philippines during the war, there was this woman who invented banana ketchup. And banana ketchup was basically like how they fed people because of the shortage of food. And I just think that it's like so ingenious because women are always so resourceful when it comes to like, oh, how we're going to feed this amount of people, how we're going to make this work. And I just think that these are some of the stories that are so untalked about in terms of like the war and how it affects people.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not surprising that when we talk about World War II, it's Europe centered. White supremacy, what? Like, we're I've read, even just fiction books. I've read so many books on the Holocaust, from textbooks to historical fiction to real stories. There's so much coverage. And I'm a history major, and a lot of the things you're telling me, new stories for me. And so much of our, World War II education does center on Europe. So I guess, like, what parts of the Pacific War do you think are most underreported or even intentionally left out of history? And maybe even more importantly, like, what do you wish people knew and understood?
I wish people understood that America involvement in the Pacific War was not 1941 Pearl Harbor. It was way longer than that, like 10 years before Pearl Harbor even happened. Japan had invaded Manchuria in China, and started a full-on invasion starting 1937. And talking about the Holocaust and whatnot, it was so interesting to me that I was reading about the rape of Nanking, and the Japanese people were so brutal that there was a Nazi in Nanjing that said, and he was a card carrying Nazi. He was using a swastika on top of his building to tell the Japanese that, hey, I'm a Nazi. We're friends. Don't bomb us. And he used that to like protect this building of like other Chinese refugees. And his name was John Rabe. And then he started writing letters to the Nazi headquarters, telling them that, hey, maybe we shouldn't be friends with these Japanese people because they're so brutal. And
Wow.
Coming from a Nazi.
that
and it was so fascinating that like that when I was reading that story, it blew my mind.
I
And
bet.
and there was a American woman at the time named Minnie Vautrin in Nanjing who was also serving in the international safety zone, and she was a missionary, and she also saved like thousands of women and children from being raped and killed by Japanese soldiers. And I think that's very interesting that like basically Minnie Vautrin and John Robbie and other Westerners were witnessing this like brutal accounts of basically brutalities, and that was 1937. And then you have 4 years of fighting before 1941 when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. And then right after that, like in 8 hours, you have the Japanese bombers went to like Hong Kong and also invaded a bunch of Southeast Asian countries. And it's just so interesting because we think about history as like one incident and like Pearl Harbor and then like end of World War II, and that's it. But then we don't look at a map and be like, oh, Pearl Harbor is actually very close to like Hong Kong and also Southeast Asia, and that's why it was strategic for them to bomb it. Like, I think we need to take lessons from history and learn from the past and how it affects other events in history. So yeah, I wish more people can like teach it in like a domino effect kind of way, and also like how one event affect another.
No, I appreciate that. I like that. And I think it just sort of accents how the United States, has been sort of isolated from the rest of the world. Like I remember, I don't mean to sidetrack us a second, but I remember I used to go to Europe for work a lot when I was, a couple decades ago now, and I'd watch the news here and just see US news. I'd go to Europe and I'd see world news, right? I'd see like everything, like different things. And it just really struck me how isolated we are, not just like in terms of the continent, but that media for decades now has not, introduced us to the rest of the world, like the average person.
I would argue it's for a whole century,
For
because
a whole century. Okay.
and
Yeah.
what's interesting is that our US news, for me, this is just it's yellow journalism in the sense that, okay, so
Mm-hmm.
let's go back to even before World War II. In like 1890s, they wanted to take Cuba. And so then the news would start playing like, I think it was New York Post. One of the
Yeah.
New York papers started saying that the Spanish men were raping Cubans and we need to go in there and liberate Cubans. And that's when Teddy Roosevelt, yeah, and this happened in like the 1980s, no, in the 1890s, when Teddy Roosevelt was vice president. And so you have like this like image of Rough Rider Roosevelt, and then that's what happened with the American Spanish War. And people are like saying that, oh, America has been an isolationist country, but then when you look at it for the last century, I don't think that America is really an isolationist country.
Oh, not from a military or economic domination standpoint. I'm just saying in terms of what the average
Yeah.
person is taking in, right?
And so like the
Yeah.
news and like the reality are so different in a
Yeah.
way that, and also what's been interesting is that I've been doing these podcasts with James Bradley, and he wrote about the Imperial Cruise, which is very fascinating. I didn't even know that Teddy Roosevelt had basically conquered the Philippines after the American Spanish War. George Dewey, they were even selling Dewey soap, like, oh, if you use this Dewey soap, you can basically become more white, and becoming more white is actually better for you, and blah blah blah. And it was
That's horrible.
That's crazy.
I feel like we need to get that out on social media that happened. Oh my gosh.
and it's so fascinating to me that that kind of perception, in my opinion, is still happening in the Philippines today, because I've seen like commercials where they're like, oh, it's going to help you whiten your skin and whatever. I feel like that inspiration probably came from George Dewey conquering the Philippines. And like the American Spanish War, it ended up, when America conquered Philippines, it ended up having like 250,000 people died from
Really?
that. Like when Philippines like became a colony, like apparently America was then waterboarding the Filipinos, and that's like where the waterboarding started. And it's like, so, and 250,000 Filipinos died, and it's like 400,000 Americans died in World War II, and we still talk about it. And no one talks about, like,
No one.
the conquering of Philippines by America.
Nobody.
So I think it's just this kind of like historical truth that we really need to push out there. And and reality. And I feel like reality and the news are two different things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think, the victors get to write history. And so they write the parts that make them look better or make us look better. And so, the kind of work that you're doing to make these stories. Oh, there's your birdie, right? Heard the bird in
Sorry,
the
my birdie
background.
wants to be my birdie wants to talk to.
Your birdie the historian. Um, but I think that's why the work that you're doing is so important because you're bringing this history in sometimes in bite-sized pieces so that people can understand like what happened and just sharing these stories is important.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And we go on Instagram, we try to make it into bite-sized pieces. I'm just trying to make it for the general audience. It's,
Yeah.
of course, there's so much history to be told that like we can't
Yeah.
make it into one bit-sized like social media post. Yeah.
But it all helps. It all helps to advance, and I do think that stories are how we break through. So,
100%. Yeah.
I appreciate the fact that you're going to these sources, interviewing these women who are, you know, this happened to them, and you're able to get their stories told in a way that hasn't been in, decades. So,
Yeah.
I guess the importance of story, like what does that mean to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that means telling the stories that haven't been told, and like sometimes those
Mm.
are found in pages, sometimes those are found in like interviews, sometimes those are found in talking to people about their family experience.
Yeah.
I met this guy who was like, "Oh, I recognize you from one of your podcasts," and then he was telling me about how he's a Chinese American and has father had fought in World War II and he wasn't able
Mm.
to get a Purple Heart, but then like our podcast inspired him to go and actually start the filing for a Purple Heart
Oh,
for what
wow.
his father did in World War II. And that is also very interesting as a World War II history like story because in 1882 Chinese Americans were barred from coming into the United States. Like any other race could come to the United States besides
Mm.
Chinese people. There was the Chinese Exclusionary Act. But once Pearl Harbor happened, then they were like, oh, China is now our favorite ally.
Mm.
And then,
Mm.
and it wasn't until like right after the war when China was then occupied by so-called communists again that they then cut that kind of relationship. And so I think historically, political ally and whatnot, it's always like interesting with how it works with like the power dynamic and what is in trend. But at the end of the day, it's like the people's stories that matter, and it's the stories
Yeah.
that shape their generation
Yeah.
and people's identities and what had happened to them really matter because you if we don't learn from history, then history is just bound to happen again.
Yes. Yes.
Very well said.
Very well said. So, with that thought in mind, how do you think we can, in this moment in time, learn from history? How do we connect what's happened in the past to where we are now?
Yeah, so Venezuela is a very interesting point of story because what Venezuela was doing, I'm not on either side. I'm not saying that, oh, Venezuela president was a great guy. I'm not also saying that what United States was also great. I'm just saying that when Venezuela president was taken, just in the beginning of this month. Oh my gosh, that happened not too long ago.
Not too long ago.
I thought that was like 3 years ago. January is so long.
This woman.
Yeah, oh my gosh. And it's just interesting because now we have all like kind of forgotten about it. And that kind of reminds me of
How is that possible even, right?
Yeah, exactly. We all
The
think it's so
overwhelm.
long ago, but
Yeah.
it was just this month. And
Yeah.
what it just reminded me of the gunboat diplomacy that I was just talking about earlier when Matthew Perry showed up on the Japanese shore when on the Edo Bay, which is like, to open them up for trade. Japan was an isolationist country. And but the United States told them, oh, you need to be more like us. And so then Japan then went on and sent everyone of their scholar to the West. Whoever who was inspiring to become like a leader in Japan then went to the West to learn like from what could be done, how Japan can be just more like the United States. And what was so fascinating about that experience is that they even went to Wall Street. They even went to become friends with Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt brought them to Wall Street to fundraise, to expand their military empire. And basically even wrote to them saying that, Japan is basically the Yankees of the East. And so they're playing our rules. And that's why Teddy Roosevelt was so in favor with on the side of Japan in terms of the Russo-Japanese War, because they were basically, he thought that he was on the Yankee side, for example. And that's why Roosevelt basically handed Korea to Japan. And, 50 years later, Japan surprise attacked America. And so I feel like that style of gunboat diplomacy is bound to have some kind of reaction or consequences. Like every action that we have as a country or as like just military power is going to have a reaction. Like we might not see the consequence today. We might not see the consequence tomorrow, but we might see it in 10 or 20 years or 50 years. That's like how when Teddy Roosevelt greenlit Japan to take Korea, but then he thought it was going to stop, but then it never stopped. And then it led to Japan then becoming so big that it attacked America. So, yeah.
Interesting. And so you're talking about some high level like policy history you alluded to before is like the reparations, because this trauma it's on people, right? Like
Yes.
and so, the idea of like, in our country, we're not so much in reparations, the acknowledgement that is like the first step towards closure and reconciliation. So, I think that's how healing begins. Is that like, what are your thoughts on how
I
you
think
learn to
so.
heal from this history and the trauma instilled?
Yes. And what I was saying before, that South Korea is still having their weekly protests against Japan just because of the brutality that they face during not just World War II, but right after Teddy Roosevelt handed them to Japan. And who was Teddy Roosevelt to tell people in Asia how they should live?
Exactly. Exactly.
And like I believe in sovereignty, I believe that countries should just do what they want to do. But Teddy Roosevelt wanted that kind of sphere of influence in the Pacific. And I think that in a level of understanding and also reparation, it's a very interesting topic because traditionally reparation is a higher concept where they pay each other's governments, and then they, the victims don't get really They could say that we have already paid reparation to your government, but then they don't pay reparation to the victims and the people who have actually experienced the pain and the
Right.
brutality and the torture. And I'm saying that I think if the government acknowledged what had happened, for example, if the US government acknowledged what had happened in the Philippines, or like if Japan acknowledged what had happened in um, Korea and in China, then I think that's one of the first step toward healing. I think
Yeah.
one of the South Korean comfort women who was very loud and demanding reparations, and I don't blame her because she experienced some real trauma when she was younger, and she
Yeah.
talked about reparation, and they finally set up this Asian Women Fund where they were going to pay, I think, like maybe dimes on the dollar. And she was not happy about that. And she was upset with her government for even, entertaining that
Mm.
so-called Asian Women Fund. So, and I think reparation really needs to come from the heart. So in Japan, there is still a Yasukuni shrine where they worship their Class A war criminals. So, for example, can you imagine if Germany enshrined Hitler or like, Auschwitz doctors, and then they go and worship them? But a lot of high level politicians still do that in Japan. And so
Interesting.
then when they're talking about setting up this Asian Women Fund, and then they're talking about at the same time like going to visit this Yasukuni shrine, then it's going to anger a lot of
Mhm.
people, and the protest is just going to continue. So I think there's a different level. Like we need to acknowledge what had happened to people that suffer through all these traumatic experiences, as well as, promising never again. But how can you promise never again if the first time was never talked about?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and a lot of people don't understand it, and, what I was connecting with what you're saying in modern history is, like, there's a direct line to what we're going through in our country as well, in that, the Confederate statues that were being pulled down, that was, like, the episode we did with Nora Noose, that was happening in Charlottesville, and then it led to these Nazis coming to the street, and it was like a direct line to the January 6th insurrection. So it is history repeating itself. And I think part of it is because we're not talking about it. We're not acknowledging it. And people want to be heard and they want to be validated, right? And these are decades of people's lives that have been, impacted due to policies and just really bad things the government is
So,
doing.
yeah, it makes me wonder. I mean, we've been talking a lot about perception in the United States. Do you have any insight into perception in Japan? In terms of, I mean, you said they still have the statues up, but is there any movement in Japan of people who are ashamed of that or would like to see those kind of like what we've seen here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's really great question. There was a guy who reached out, and I think he worked at Unit 731 as a teenager, because by the end of the war, there was just basically no one to work in these like human experimentation camps, because the focus was to finish the war and to win it. And so a lot of the adults went and fought the war, versus like the teenagers went to work at like youth corps and for
Mm.
camps like Unit 731. And Unit 731 was basically like an Asian Auschwitz, where
Oh.
um mm, people were used for human experimentations in Japan occupied Manchuria. And what's interesting is that he wants to talk because he's now like 95, and but
Mhm.
his wife and his daughter they don't want him to
Mhm.
talk because they're going to get
Interesting.
ostracized.
Hmm.
So there are people who want to talk about their wartime experience, but then, cultural like acceptance is not there yet. And there was also a guy whose father worked at Unit 1644, which was another biolab in Nanjing, and he didn't realize what his father was doing until after his father passed away. He has like this whole attic of stuff. And so he was going
Hmm.
through it, and then he has pictures and whatnot. And what I find is so interesting is that the news always framed this guy as like he's some kind of expert, but he was like, I'm not an expert. And he would try to go to the government for more documents, and the government like archive only has like a list of people who are working at this lab, and he's like, okay, well, that's not of any help. And so what's interesting is that like just because we think about them as an aggressor too doesn't mean that they're just an aggressor and they didn't take in like part of the PTSD. Because I also talked to this guy whose father was in the Quantum Army that occupied China from like 1931, and he was telling me that his father, when he was done with the war, they were often like facing nightmares, and his
Mhm.
father would then became very brutal and would
Right.
have often like drink and then like beat his mom. And it's those kind of like trauma. And of course back in the day they didn't know what PTSD was,
Right.
but then he found like these albums of his father being normal and like going to like the spa and whatnot. And and he wants to know how his father was like before the war,
Yeah.
right? And so that's why he's now thinking that like, oh, we need to study PTSD even more, because he's
Okay.
sure that like the current like generation of Japan all suffer from one form of PTSD or another.
Yeah.
So I think it's like a lot of like intergenerational like dynamics that we
Yeah.
all need to understand, and like we can all heal as, I mean, this is going to sound cringy, but like we can all heal as, as
No,
a
I
world.
I think you're
Yeah.
right. And to take it back to the idea of how women are affected, I mean, they're the women that were directly affected in the wars or the occupations, but then women, I think, are very much affected by the result, even if, the husband or the father comes home and now the woman has to deal with whatever trauma that person has experienced and how to integrate that person back into the family. And to your point, that most of history, no one knew how to do that, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
there was no mental health professionals around to call or a book
And
to
I think
read.
especially in Asia, where it's
Yeah.
kind of like a taboo topic to talk about your mental health,
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't
Yes.
think, yeah. So I think there needs to be some understanding of that. And
Yeah.
also, yeah, so there's a whole lot
Do
we
you
can talk about.
do you find that is that changing a little bit? And like nowadays, like we never talked about therapy, even in this country. The future generations they talk much more about mental health and, emotional resilience. And, we even teach it at school, like social emotional learning. Is that happening across Asia, in Japan? Like, are there cracks where,
There are little cracks, but I think, societal norms is still a big thing in Asia.
yeah,
And so,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it's also very interesting too, because like I don't know how to say it in like the more correct way, but it's been like, for example, you're not going to make a Instagram account named Hitler and then start like, trolling people who talk about like Holocaust, right? But then for some reason, it's okay for these people to make accounts named like, Tojo Hideki, and then start trolling about like history accounts about like what
mm.
had happened in Asia when like Japan was an aggressor and whatnot. And so I just find that kind of behavior like very double standard. And it's very interesting that like, and it just shows that like not even people who work at Instagram, probably on that kind of team about community guidelines, don't really have a historical understanding about what had happened in Asia during World War II.
So this is such like emotionally demanding work.
Mm.
Um, have you come across moments of courage or resistance that have really stayed with you? And also, what's been really rewarding for you personally?
Yeah, so what's been really rewarding for me is I contacted this woman, Jean B. Chan, And she was talking about her experience in China when she was in the war, while she was a child, and she actually lost her brother after that. And she's been telling us about how, but after the war, she was a strong girl. So then she went to Hong Kong, and then she went to Chicago and got her PhD in mathematics. And she was a math professor, and she just never talked about World War II since then. But then they went and watched a World War II movie. Her late husband and her watched a World War II movie, and she was crying so hard that her
Wow.
husband had to like bring her into the car, and like he's never seen that part of her. And so when I first connected with her and I told her like, hey, can you talk about your experience with our interns, because we have a internship program. She was crying so hard when we were doing that for the first time, and like and I also brought her to like Holocaust Center where they had a day of learning, and we were talking about World War II experience
Yeah.
throughout the world as well. And she was also crying really hard. But by like I think last year when we had a conference, she dropped like a tear. And so for
Okay.
her, it's been healing for her just to talk about that kind of wartime experience, and to find that kind of healing, I think is very incredible. And also the other day I was scrolling through YouTube as normal, and I found this history like podcaster influencers. What do you call those people? YouTuber
Yeah.
who used one of our research material called Unit 731 cover up.
Oh,
And he
no.
used our book to make a YouTube video and had 2.5 million views. It was
Wow.
amazing. It was awesome. I reached out. I never heard back. He probably gets a lot of things in his inbox. So for me, that's been rewarding just to see that like some of the research that we do are getting out there, and also seeing that like survivors are finding their moments of healing
Yeah.
with the work that we've been doing.
Well, it sounds like you've given them a platform to be able to process, to be able to share their story and, process it, then you heal. And when you can talk about it, like you said, with one tear instead of breaking down, like that's the that's when you can share your story and share it with others and move forward. So like well done. That you've created like this safe space for healing, but also like this just super interesting stories that you're getting out there. Like so you work on books, documentaries, and there's also classroom learning, right?
Yes, we have lesson plans. Before COVID, we were more active on that, but I think we're going to go back onto like maybe also doing webinars about how to tell those World War II stories in Pacific, and
Mhm.
also to like do lesson plans on how, U.S. policies in the last century
Right.
had basically caused almost a very disastrous, um, f- foreign policy in Asia. And
Mm.
talking about Teddy Roosevelt, and it was really getting on my nerves about like all this news about Iran. Um, his grandson threw the coup that actually overthrew the democratically elected Iranian president
Mhm.
in 1953. And so when I was hearing about like, oh, how there's a lack of democracy, I'm like, yes, because Teddy Roosevelt's
Because of
grandson
us.
took a part of that. His name is Kermit Roosevelt. And so
Mhm.
so like it's always been the back of my mind, like, oh, what are the Roosevelts up to? Like I need to know.
Keep an Gotta keep an eye on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting, and then again, I mean, I don't wanna get too far off, the topic of what you usually study, but again, women, are so deeply affected by what we did there and the loss of, civil rights and that sort of thing, so, yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So, when you look back on your body of work, what do you hope that it ultimately accomplishes?
I think this sounds very cheesy, but I think world peace, because if you look at the geopolitical situation in Asia right now, we're very close to a World War III. You might not see it, but Japan is now spending 2% of their GDP on weapons, and US bases are surrounding, Japan and Korea and China. And I think that studying history is going to uncover a lot of this geopolitical tension and where it came from and where it all stemmed from. And so we all need to understand where those stories come from. So, yeah. I was reading about Teddy Roosevelt involvement in the Philippines from one of James Bradley's book in the Imperial Cruise, and the people in Cebu were asking for foreign aid because their country was basically looted by the United States military, but they don't talk about that, right? And so then Secretary of State Taft was making a speech about how other people need to work like Americans and pull yourself out by bootstraps and whatnot. But what they didn't talk about is how the Americans had just burned down like a huge part of Cebu. Right. And so then when this guy was asking for foreign aid, America had just conquered it, but yet they're telling them to work on themselves with bootstraps is so ironic to me. And that's what makes me think that, like, if we just don't get involved, maybe there's no need for foreign aid, right?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's
similar dynamics to here and the Tulsa massacre. And I mean,
yeah.
Native Americans. I mean, this goes throughout our history of colonialism and it's
It's so
just an easy
fascinating
one to
to me
solve.
too, because it's just like every action has a reaction and people don't see it.
But we weren't the first imperialists, to be
Yeah,
honest.
no, we weren't. It's okay. I
So,
think it's just important to learn from history.
yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think it's been a pattern, and we're the matriarchy. So we can kind of blame it on patriarchal mindsets, this sort of pattern of, needing power, needing to be in control and that sort of thing.
Yes.
And
And
that's
it
a
really
lot of what we're trying to explore here. Obviously we don't have the answers. People are addicted to powers, and if it's not us, then is it
right,
Russia?
yes.
Is it, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, so I think that's really interesting. Yeah.
And greater transparency as
Yes,
well.
I
And
think
and th- and
so.
that's the problem, right? Because this is being hidden. It's being pushed under the rug. There must be some kind of balance.
Yes, I think accountability and
Mhm.
transparency. I think that those are really important because, for example, like the immunity deal, right, that was happening with a lot of the war criminals with Unit 731 who was doing biological research. And then later down the line, they were like, oh, we're going to obtain this research for Fort Detrick. I think if the media had just gone out and say that, people would just have moved on. But it's because it was covered up for so
Yeah.
long that people have problem with it. And so I think if it was more transparent and it was more accountable where the money was going, I think people would have been okay.
Yeah.
Follow the money.
All
the
the
money.
money. Well, it is all money. I mean, really, when it comes
Yeah.
down to it, it's all money and resources.
And
So
control. I mean, I don't know. I think money is a way to gain control. Like I think
sure,
power.
power.
And
Yeah,
control.
but
Yeah, and it's also interesting because then, like, at the end of the day, right, when all these men, like what I was saying earlier, with PTSD and whatnot, it's the women at home that are going to bear the consequences of
Right.
it. So, yeah.
well, yeah, absolutely. The women and children, and like you said, it becomes generational then until it's broken, right? Until that somehow something interjects to heal, whether it's going to therapy or I don't know, like obviously I'm a believer in therapy. I think that's how you
You
heal,
are.
but maybe people have other ways, I don't know. So yeah. Well, thank you for your work. It's been eye-opening for me, and not that I was totally unaware of the effects, but I honestly, I didn't know the number was 30 million. I did not know that before, reading your stuff. So thank you for what you're doing. And I think, and I hope, do you find that you were mentioning some like helping with syllabuses and stuff like that and curriculum? Do you work with a lot of colleges to help them put together their curriculum?
Currently, people go on their website, and then I have had like professors who reach out to us and say that they've been using it. And we also, last year, we had a group of high school students who reached out of the blue to talk about Unit 731, and they wanted to use some of our resources on our website to put
Mm,
together a documentary about Unit 731, and they won first place in New Mexico. So that's been
wow,
rewarding.
that is rewarding.
Yeah. So it's rewarding to see that, the younger generation is using our resources. And what's interesting also is that I was reading a survey that a lot of Gen Zs don't even know who were the Axis and who were the countries in the ally, and
Mhm. Yeah.
so it's extra encouraging when I see that they're using our
Yeah.
website.
Yeah, and they're hungry for that information is what I
Yeah.
find with Gen Z. I think they want to know, but yeah, you're right. It's not it isn't being taught as well as it could be.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
thank you for
Yeah.
your work. Yeah.
Thank you.
Um, with all the darkness that you write about and study about and interview people about, is it hard to hold on to hope?
No, I think it's very hopeful every day. I'm like pretty excited to wake up and
Good.
because I interact with so many people on like just our social media, our email page. I mean, when we send out email, people are like, "Oh, I didn't know about this before." So it's for me, it's been really rewarding to tell these untold stories about what had
Yeah.
happened in
Yeah.
that had affected so many people.
Yeah. But you have purpose. This is your purpose and it's needed. So that is hopeful. That's kind of what this brings for me, a little bit of hope. I get to talk to people like you.
Well, I wanted to ask, how can people find out more? Where can they find resources? And obviously, we'll put in the show notes, but would love to hear from you, like some of the books, the resources that you're doing. Where can people find that? And also, what are you working on next?
We are organizing a lot of the documents that we scanned in the last 10 years. And so some of the documents, I'm just like, wow, maybe this fits into here. And so we're actually building exhibition on our online archive so then people can more easily access it. And we have a podcast on YouTube, Pacific Front Untold. James Bradley, who's a New York Times bestselling author, goes on it twice a month, and we talk about history and historical truth. And you can find us on Instagram on Pacific Atrocities EDU, or you can also find us on our website, pacificatrocities.org.
Okay, so Instagram. Are you on other social media too, or just Instagram?
Just Instagram and Facebook, and
Okay.
also LinkedIn
Okay.
and YouTube. Yep.
All right. And can people subscribe to your mail? You mentioned
Yes,
emails, your
email
email
list.
list on your website. Is that right?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, great. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess like to sum up the main stories that I'd like to learn more about as well. I mean, we know a lot about the Holocaust, a lot's been reported, but knowing about the Nanjing massacre, what happened at Unit 731, comfort women, and like that would be a good place to start. Like if you could say, I know this a little bit of the history or the story behind there. Is that fair? Because I'd like to give people something and myself, like,
Yeah,
okay,
I think that's
what am I
fair.
going?
And I think that's fair. And I think, yes, that would be a great place to start. And also to learn more about like forced labor camps that happened to a
Mm.
lot of the American POWs. Um, that would be great as well. Yeah.
All right. So our final question of each and every podcast. um, Jenny, what does the matriarchy mean to you?
I think that's a very good question. Obviously, I'm a woman, and how I started this nonprofit was because of my grandma who told me the stories. And so I think like women's role in history and also at home are so understated. I mean, just
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, without my grandma's telling me those stories, I wouldn't even have thought about World War II in Asia. And so I think the matriarchy is undertold and underrated.
Well, thank you very much for sharing,
Yeah.
your personal journey. I always think it's fascinating to hear how people get into this work. I mean, you started not at all in history and pivoted. Look at you now.
Yeah.
Well, I'm an engineer and I'm doing a podcast now, so make it make sense. All right.
All right. Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank
Jenny.
you for being here,
Bye.
Jenny. Thank
Bye.
you.
Oh, it's a lot. It's a lot to
It's a
take
lot.
in. I think she's just so correct that we don't know these things and
Yeah,
we have to keep talking about it. That's the only way we,
yeah.
know about it because the powers that be aren't telling us, at least not in this country, aren't telling us these things. So,
Yeah, and also there's so much history out there, right?
yeah,
And it's shocking to me how I mean, I'm a history major. There's so much I don't know. There's so much I was never
yeah,
taught. And I took a class in Southeast Asian history. It was like
yeah,
one semester. Like, how much
yeah,
can you cover? You
yeah,
know?
yeah.
Um,
Well, that's the thing. There is so much history. But still, I do think that in our country, we're so centered on us.
yes.
And we are, mm, I'm gonna go ahead and use the word propagandized to believe that we're the best and that we're the most important. And I think in that like way of thinking, then anything that's going to challenge that, even if it means that we did this incursion into the Philippines or something like that's going to challenge that, right?
Yeah.
Um, and certainly where we started, which is how we've affected women across the globe, when which probably should have been a clue. Honestly, it probably should have been a clue that, the women's rights that we've gained here are very fragile, because
Yeah.
we have not been taking women seriously, ever, really. So, yeah, I think her work is so important, and I was just so excited to have her here to share it with us. So,
I'm so glad that she reached out to us.
yeah,
Sharing these personal stories and like learning more about the history. And honestly, Lisa, I think that's why we are where we are today. You know, as a nation, we are reckoning with a pretty ugly past that a lot of
yeah,
people don't want to really look into. And
right.
it doesn't mean that we blame people, but we have to understand and we have to acknowledge and people just want to be seen and heard and validated.
Yeah, of course.
It's
Yeah.
eh,
And I do think it's twofold, I know X amount of people who don't wanna look at what our country has done wrong. I know
yeah,
there's a lot of people who just don't wanna look at it, and you just wanna think that, we're whatever, we're the the greatest. And
America.
then and then, though, there's, like, another whole segment of, people who believe that, and I guess that's kinda why I wanted to make that point today, is that we're the only imperialist, right? Like, we're the worst imperialist, and we are bad. Like, I don't wanna, like,
We do
but
things that are not good.
we have done many things and we continue to do many things that are not good. I do not wanna take away from that. But there are other powers on the globe
Yeah.
that have also that are also right now not good, or in the past have not been good. And and have, conquered and killed and, you know, all the abuses that we see of war and totalitarianism. Um, so I think it's a human condition,
Yes.
and I do think that living in the United States of America in 2026, I think we should be the place to start changing this and start changing the way humans approach other humans. That's what I believe.
Yeah. And you say it's a human condition. I mean, it is, but these are systemic. Yeah, babies aren't born, we're not born like racist. We're not born putting values on like better, worse, you know.
Agreed.
It,
But when I say human condition, I mean like I think every race has a tribalistic part of their
yes.
culture, right?
Yes.
Um and I just think that like I believe in evolution. I believe evolutionary we just haven't really addressed that well enough yet. And I think now is the time. I think now is the time that
Yeah.
it's time to realize we're all more alike than that. I don't care what your skin color is. I don't care like what sex you are or what, a
Yeah.
million things. So her work is really, really important because I think it shows that, right? It shows that and it helps people see themselves and other people. And I appreciate that.
Yeah. And, like we've talked about a lot is cooperation over competition and uplifting the people around you and approaching society that you are helping the most vulnerable, not putting them down and having power over. And the work she's doing has already opened a lot of doors. Like, I'm sure her internship program is amazing. And how great that a high school class, like, reached out to them and, like,
That's
we're studying Unit
exciting.
731, and
Yeah.
yeah, that's so
And then
great.
there's probably so many people who that she doesn't even know who are looking at her website and, getting help from that
Yeah,
because go to her website, audience,
yeah,
or her organization's website. It is just chock full of information and it's eye-opening.
it is,
So,
yeah. And it's interesting
yeah,
too. This is not just, like, eat your vegetables. This is, like, a really rich, history that is,
yeah, it's well put
you
together.
know
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I liked another thing that she said is that she found us on YouTube. It's working.
That is so exciting. So glad she joined
Yeah.
us,
Yeah.
and
Well, thank you, audience. We really appreciate your time and the time that you spend with us, coming along with us. And, don't forget to hit like, hit subscribe, share with your friend.
oh, and Kath designed some new shirts. Go check them out. My husband bought one. He's wearing it all over town, and people are like, "Ooh, I'd like your shirt." It's a sweatshirt.
Yay!
Sweatshirt.
Well,
So go check that out, guys. You might want one.
yeah, you can find our merch on our website, which is envisionthematriarchy.com, and we
Yeah.
also have an Etsy shop.
Yes, we do. Yes,
Yeah.
we do.
So
So,
search up the Matriarchy podcast, I think it is on Etsy. But if you
yeah.
just type in matriarchy on Etsy, some of our merch pops up first, which is so exciting.
So, all right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate you listening to our podcast and participating anywhere as possible on social media with us. And welcome to the matriarchy.
Welcome to our community.